He thought the weight of the crown would break me. He thought I would come to him in the 10th month or the 11th month, or on the final grey morning of our royal decree and drop to my knees on the cold marble of the throne room. He expected me to ask quietly, the way cast-out women of fallen houses were expected to ask if I might be permitted to remain in his shadow. King Alaric of House Stirling had miscalculated in a way that only a monarch who had never been refused could miscalculate. He did not know that I had been counting down the days since the morning his signet ring was pressed into my trembling hand. I was not counting up the way a hopeful royal bride might. I was counting down. And on the morning of day 364 I walked into his private council chamber with the royal diamond in one palm and the heavy gold crown of Aurelia in the other. I laid them both on his dark oak desk. Before he had even finished pouring his morning wine, what the king did in the 24 hours that followed is the whole of this story. But to understand the gravity of those hours, to understand why a kingdom held its breath, and why the court finally bowed to the truth, you must understand the 363 days that preceded them, and the morning nearly a year before that, when King Alaric rode into the ruined courtyard of my father's estate with a treaty and army at his back, and a proposition he believed no women in my desperate position could refuse. He was wrong about that too. I could have refused him. I simply chose not to. My name is Aurelia Vance. In the harsh spring of my 23rd year, the noble house of Vance failed, in a manner that was both entirely unexceptional and utterly catastrophic. It was unexceptional because half the minor lords in the Western Reach had fallen to ruin that season under the crushing taxes of the crown. It was catastrophic because my father had borrowed against our ancient castle and the castle against the farmlands, and the farmlands against a royal legacy that no longer carried any weight in the capital. I was the eldest of 4. My brother Julian was 15, and at the military academy, which we could no longer afford to pay for. My sisters Beatrice and Alara were 12 and 9, blissfully unaware that their governesses were packing their trunks to leave before the next moon. The servants knew, of course. In a falling house, the servants always know before the masters. I was standing in the grand hall staring at the faded tapestries of our ancestors, attempting to compose a plea to a distant uncle, when the heavy oak doors were thrown open. The royal guards entered first, their armor gleaming with the terrifying crest of House Stirling. Then the king himself stepped into the ashes of our home. I had never seen him in person. I knew of King Alaric the way one knows of a brutal, unforgiving winter. He was 31, unmarried, famously cold, unyielding in his justice, and seated upon a throne that had crushed stronger men than my father. He had no reason to stand in our decaying hall. He had no reason to know my name. My father fell to his knees immediately. The king did not even look at him. He looked at me. He was impossibly tall, his dark hair swept back from a face that looked as though it had been carved from the very stone of his fortress. His eyes were a pale, piercing grey that seemed to strip the air from the room. "Lady Aurelia!" The king's voice was low, carrying effortlessly through the cavernous space. "Send your father away. My business is with you." I did not flinch, though the corset tightened around my ribs until I could barely draw breath. I nodded to my father, who scrambled out of the hall without a backward glance. The king did not ask me to sit. He did not offer courtesies. "I require a queen." King Alaric stated, his voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "For reasons concerning the stability of the realm and the royal council. The marriage will last exactly 1 year. The end of that year, by royal decree, we will separate. You will be stripped of the title, but you will retain a royal stipend sufficient to restore your father's lands and secure your family's status for the next century. After the 365th day, you will be exiled from the capital, free to live out your days far from the throne." He unrolled a heavy parchment sealed with black wax and dropped it onto the table between us. "I am offering you the salvation of your bloodline now," he continued. "I am offering you the crown as the strict condition of receiving it." I stared at the parchment. Silence, I'd learned in the bitter weeks of our ruin, was a weapon that extracted truth far better than panic. I let the silence stretch until the royal guards shifted uncomfortably. The king remained perfectly still. "I do not require affection, Lady Aurelia," he said, his tone sharpening. "I do not require an heir from you. I require a queen in the palace, a queen in name, and a woman whose conduct will not embarrass the throne during the contracted period. That is the entirety of your duty." "Why 1 year?" I asked, keeping my spine as straight as a blade, his pale eyes locked onto mine. "Because the ancient laws of Valyria dictate that a king must wed before his 32nd naming day to unlock the full war coffers of the crown. My birthday falls in 3 weeks. The High Council will release the funds to me 1 year after the royal marriage is consecrated. Once the gold is secured to fortify the northern borders, the marriage may be dissolved without political consequence. I have 3 other names on my list. You are simply the most convenient as your father's desperation ensures your silence. He was the most arrogant, ruthless creature I had ever encountered. He was treating the sacred crown of Valyria like a merchant's receipt. Yet by any logical measure, he was my family's only salvation. My uncle would not answer my letters. My mother's jewels were already gone. Without this, my brother would be sent to the infantry to die, and my sisters would be sold into terrible marriages. 1 year. I said, my voice steady, though my fingers dug into the silk of my skirts. Precisely 1 year, not a single day more, and the royal stipends are transferred to my father's vaults before I walk down the aisle of the great chapel. Agreed, the king said smoothly. And 1 further condition, I added, raising my chin. He narrowed his eyes. I will count the days, your grace. I will count them visibly, and I will count them openly. And on the 365th morning, I will walk out of your palace gates without looking back. I want you to know from the very first hour I wear your crown that I am not your true queen. I'm your political prisoner serving a sentence. When the sentence expires, I will leave. For a fraction of a second, the cold mask of King Alaric slipped. A shadow crossed his pale eyes. Something dangerously close to surprise, perhaps even insult. A king is not used to being told his crown is a prison sentence. But the expression vanished instantly. Agreed, he said coldly. We were married 17 days later in the royal chapel of the capital beneath the towering arches of white stone. There was no grand celebration, no cheering crowds. The witnesses were only the high priest, the captain of the guard, and the king's grandmother, Dowager Queen Eleanor. She was a woman of 80, half blind, but possessing an aura that made even the king lower his voice in her presence. After the vows were spoken and the heavy silver ring was placed on my finger, the Dowager Queen approached me. Her withered hands trembled as she pressed a small ancient bronze key into my palm. It was shaped like a coiled dragon. This belongs to the deepest vaults of the palace. The Dowager whispered, her sightless eyes fixed on my face. Wear it. A queen of Valyria must always carry the weight of the house. I looked at King Alaric. His jaw was clenched. He gave a microscopic shake of his head, not out of refusal, but out of grim resignation. It is only a loan, grandmother, the king said quietly. Until the year is out. I threaded the bronze key onto a black silk ribbon that very afternoon and tied it tight against my collarbone. I did not take it off, not even once, in the 363 days that followed. That night, in the vast echoing solitude of the Queen's chambers, I opened the top drawer of my mahogany vanity. I placed a thick leather-bound ledger inside. It was not a diary of royal secrets. It was an accounting book. With a sharp quill, I drew a single heavy black line on the first page. At the bottom I wrote the number, 364 days remaining. I left the drawer slightly open. The counting had begun, and the kingdom had no idea that the woman wearing its crown was already packing her bags to leave it behind. The first 40 days of my reign were an exercise in breathing through a corset made of ice. We established a rhythm, the king and I, the way a warden and a prisoner establish a rhythm within the walls of a grand fortress. We did not share a bed. We barely shared the same air. I was given the Queen's wing, a sprawling expanse of rooms lined with velvet curtains and warmed by massive stone hearths that never quite managed to chase away the chill of the marble floors. My days were structured with the suffocating precision of royal protocol. I wore the heavy silk gowns. I sat beside him at the state banquets, my spine straight as a blade, projecting the serene, untouchable majesty required of the crown. I listened to the sycophantic praise of the court, nobles, men and women who would have spat on my family's ruined name a month prior, now bowing deeply as my skirts swept past them. I learned the labyrinthine halls of the palace, the echoing corridors, where footsteps sounded like approaching doom, and the heavy scent of beeswax candles and crushed winter roses that clung to everything. And every morning before I allowed my ladies in, waiting to dress me, I opened the mahogany drawer. I took out the leather-bound ledger. I drew a single vertical line. At the end of the week, I struck a diagonal slash through the 7 marks. I never hid the book. If a maid opened the drawer to retrieve my jewels, she would see it. If the king's spies searched my chambers, they would find it. I wanted it seen. It was my only anchor in a sea of gold and lies. It was on the 41st morning that the silent war between the king and his temporary queen finally broke the surface. We had taken to breaking our fast together in the eastern solar, not out of any desire for company, but to maintain the illusion of unity before the watchful eyes of the servants. The winter sun was weak, casting long pale shadows across the silver platters. Alaric was reading reports from the border garrisons, his face a mask of absolute control. I was reading a careful, coded letter from my mother confirming that the royal stipends had arrived and the Vance lands were breathing again. My brother was secure, my sisters were safe. The sacrifice was working. Alaric set down his parchment. The sound was sharp against the quiet room. "You were in the royal library yesterday afternoon," he stated, his pale eyes fixing on me. "I was. My head steward informs me you left a leather ledger on the reading table for an hour before returning for it. A ledger filled entirely with hash marks and numbers. I set my teacup down, ensuring it did not rattle against the saucer. I record the days, Your Grace. It is a habit of mine to maintain a clear account of my standing." "That is not what the steward described," Alaric said, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave. "Would you like me to bring it down to the council chamber?" I asked, meeting his gaze evenly. I could read the numbers aloud for the court. If the crown required such transparency, silence descended heavy and absolute. The king did not blink. "I would like to know," he finally said, each word carved from ice, "whether you intend to keep your countdown on public display for the servants to gossip about." "It is not on display," I replied softly. "It sits in a drawer in my chambers. I am not flaunting it to your court, Alaric. I'm simply not hiding it from myself. You knew the terms when you bought me. I will not pretend to be swept away by the honor of your throne just to make the transaction more palatable for your pride." A muscle feathered in his jaw. For a man who commanded armies, with a flick of his wrist being spoken to as a landlord, rather than a deity, was clearly unfamiliar territory. "What is the number this morning?" he asked, the words forced out. 324. He nodded once, a sharp, rigid movement. He picked up his reports and did not speak to me again for the rest of the day. The palace, however, was not silent. A court is a living, breathing beast that feeds on weakness, and they could smell the unnatural distance between the king and his new queen. The nobles whispered behind raised fans in the drawing rooms. They noticed that Alaric never sought me out during the evening dances. They noticed that my smile never reached my eyes, and that my hand never lingered on his arm. They began to suspect that I was not a true queen, but a placeholder, a pawn to satisfy a law entirely expendable. Princess Isolde, the king's cousin, and a woman whose ambition was matched only by her cruelty, made a point of staring at my neck during a formal dinner, her lips curling into a knowing smirk. She was waiting for me to break. They all were. They expected the girl from the ruined house to crack under the isolation, to weep in the corridors, to beg the king for a scrap of validation. I gave them nothing. I wrapped my dignity around me like armor. Let them whisper. I was merely passing through their history. The only person in the entire palace who saw clearly through the pageantry was the Dowager Queen Eleanor. She summoned me to her chambers in the high tower every Tuesday and Friday. Her rooms were kept stiflingly hot-smelling of old parchment and dry herbs. On my 4th visit, she dismissed her attendants with a wave of her withered hand and gestured for me to sit close to her chair. Her milky, sightless eyes seemed to look straight through my skull. "They are waiting for you to fail, Aurelia." The old woman rasped her voice like dry leaves scraping on stone. "The vultures in the court. They think because you were bought, you are weak." "I'm not weak, Your Grace. I'm simply temporary." Eleanor chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Temporary. A dangerous word in a kingdom built on permanence. My grandson is a fool. A brilliant commander, fierce protector of the realm, but an absolute fool when it comes to the human heart." I stiffened. I do not require his heart. I only require his gold for my family, and his word that I may leave when the year is done. Do you know why he is the way he is? She asked, ignoring my protest. Do you know why the law of the war coffers was invoked in the first place? I shook my head before realizing she could not see it. No, I answered. His father, the late king, was destroyed by a queen who loved power more than the realm. She emptied the treasuries to fund a rebellion in the south, using her royal seal to forge alliances behind his back. When the betrayal was uncovered, she drank poison rather than face the executioner's block. Alaric was only 10. He watched his father shatter. He watched the kingdom nearly burn. He vowed then that he would never allow a queen to hold true power. That is why he sought a broken girl from a ruined house. He thought a desperate woman could be controlled used to unlock the funds and discarded before she could ever pose a threat. I touched the collar of my gown. Beneath the silk, the cold bronze key she had given me on my wedding day rested heavily against my skin. Why did you give me the key to the deep vaults? Then I asked quietly. If the king fears a queen with power, why did you place it in my hand? Because the Dowager Queen said, softly leaning forward, I know the difference between a traitor and a survivor. The crown does not care how you came to wear it, Aurelia. It only cares how you carry it. Alaric believes he is renting a wife. He does not realize he has installed a true queen. Keep counting your days, child. But do not forget that while you sit on the throne belongs to you. Her words haunted me. I returned to my chambers. That night, the halls silent and shadowed. I stood before the tall mirror, looking at the crown resting upon my dark hair. It felt heavier than before. I opened the drawer. I took out the quill. 311 days remaining. I struck the line, blew out the candle, and prepared for the winter that was about to test everything I thought I knew about my sentence. The winter that descended upon Valoria in the 4th month of my reign was not merely a season. It was an executioner. It swept down from the northern peaks with a ferocity that shattered stones and froze rivers mid-current. The skies turned the color of bruised iron, and the heavy snow buried the outer provinces in a suffocating grip. It was during the worst of this white nightmare that the border lords sent frantic ravens to the capital. The northern garrisons were starving, their supply lines severed by avalanches. King Alaric did not hesitate. A king forged in war cannot sit idly in a warm palace while his soldiers freeze. He marshaled his elite cavalry and prepared to ride north to carve a path through the ice himself. Before he departed, he stood in the grand foyer clad in dark furs and black armor, his presence dominating the space. I stood a respectful distance away, wearing a gown of midnight blue wool, my hands folded perfectly before me. The council will govern the capital in my absence. Alaric instructed his breath pluming in the freezing air of the hall. The palace gates are to remain sealed to conserve the royal hearths and granaries. Keep to your wing, Aurelia. Princess Isolde and the High Steward will manage the household. There is no need for you to involve yourself in the grim realities of a winter siege. As you command, your grace. I replied smoothly, my face a mask of absolute serenity. I did not tell him that I had already marked my ledger that morning. 260 days remaining. I was a tenant waiting out a storm. It was not my house to protect. He studied me for a fleeting second, his grey eyes searching for a crack in my composure. Finding none, he turned on his heel and rode out into the howling blizzard. For 3 days, the palace adhered strictly to the king's orders. The heavy iron gates were barred. The High Steward, a pompous man named Vane, who took his orders directly from Princess Isolde, inventoried the royal cellars and locked them tight. Inside the palace, the fires roared in the marble fireplaces, and the nobles drank spiced wine, complaining about the draught. But on the 4th afternoon, the reality of the kingdom arrived at our doorstep. I was sitting in the library reading when a commotion echoed from the lower courtyards. I walked to the towering glass windows and looked down. The storm had broken momentarily, revealing a sea of desperate bodies huddled against the towering iron gates of the palace. They were villagers from the lower valleys, hundreds of them driven from their collapsed homes, freezing, starving, holding crying infants wrapped in rags. Below, High Steward Vane stood on the battlements, with a contingent of royal guards shouting over the wind. The king's decree states the gates remain closed, Vane bellowed. Return to your villages, the crown cannot shelter the entire kingdom. Princess Isolde stood near him, wrapped in an exquisite white fox fur, her face twisted in disgust. Send the archers to the walls. I heard her command faintly through the glass. If they breach the gates, we will have a riot in the royal gardens. Disperse them. My breath hitched. The corset tightened around my ribs, but the cold that washed over me had nothing to do with the winter air. These were the people of Valoria, the people whose taxes paid for the silk on Isolde's back and the gold in Alaric's coffers. I closed my eyes, feeling the heavy bronze key resting against my collarbone. Aurelia Vance was a ruined noblewoman who had sold herself for a year. But Queen Aurelia was the crowned sovereign of this realm, and a queen does not let her people freeze while she drinks a spiced wine. I did not summon my ladies. I did not change into something practical. I strode out of the library in my heavy royal skirts, my spine rigid, the silver crown gleaming upon my dark hair. The echoing of my footsteps against the stone corridors felt like the beating of a war drum. When I reached the courtyard, the freezing wind bit into my skin, but I did not shiver. I walked directly toward the iron gates. The royal guards parted instinctively at the sight of my face. Halt! Princess Isolde stepped into my path, her eyes flashing with venom. What are you doing? Lady Aurelia the King ordered you to remain in your wing. I am not Lady Aurelia in this courtyard. I said, my voice quiet but carrying a deadly resonance that cut through the howling wind. I am the Queen of Valoria. Step aside, Isolde. You are a contracted guest, she hissed, stepping closer. You have no authority here. The steward commands the gates by the king's direct order. I turned my gaze to High Steward Vane, who looked suddenly nervous under the weight of my stare. Steward Vane, I commanded, my voice projecting across the frozen stones. Open the gates. Bring the women, the children, and the injured into the great hall. Fire the hearths in the lower eastern wing. Your Grace, I cannot, Vane stammered. The royal granaries are locked. We do not have the provisions for hundreds of peasants, and the king forbade. I reached up and pulled the black silk ribbon from beneath my collar. The ancient bronze key gleamed dully in the grey light. The Dowager Queen entrusted me with the key to the deep vaults. I declared holding it up for the guards and the steward to see. The ancient reserves beneath the palace hold enough grain and salted meat to feed the capital for a year. You will open the gates, Steward Vane, or I will have the captain of the guard arrest you for treason against the crown. The courtyard fell dead silent. The wind shrieked, but no one moved. Captain, I said, not breaking eye contact with Vane. Are my orders clear? The captain of the guard, a battle-hardened veteran, looked at the key, looked at my unyielding posture, and slammed his fist over his heart in a crisp salute. Perfectly clear, my queen. Open the gates, he roared. For the next 5 days and nights, I did not sleep. The great hall of the palace was transformed from a cold monument of wealth into a sanctuary of survival. I unlocked the deep vaults myself, standing in the freezing subterranean darkness, as the guards hauled out sacks of flour and dried provisions. I stripped off my royal jewels and rolled up the sleeves of my silk gown, kneeling on the marble floors to bind wounds, distribute hot broth, and rock-freezing children by the fire. Isolde and her sycophants locked themselves in the upper towers, horrified by the smell of commoners in their sacred halls. I ignored them. I managed the inventory, I directed the royal physicians, and I governed the chaos until it became perfect, life-saving order. King Alaric returned on the 9th day. He rode through the palace gates at dusk, expecting to find the silent, orderly fortress he had left behind. Instead, he walked into the great hall and stopped dead in his tracks. The cavernous room was lined with pallets and cots. The massive hearths were roaring. Servants and soldiers were moving in perfect unison, distributing the evening meal. And at the center of it, all seated at a makeshift wooden table covered in ledgers and maps, was his temporary queen. My gown was stained with soot and spilled broth. My hair had fallen loose from its intricate pins. But my back was perfectly straight, and the crown still sat immovable upon my head. Alaric handed his heavy cloak to a stunned squire and walked slowly toward me. The hall grew quiet as the king approached. The villagers shrank back in fear, expecting the executioner's axe for trespassing in the royal domain. Princess Isolde materialized from the staircase, rushing forward. Alaric, thank the gods you have returned. She went mad. She defied your orders. Open the deep vaults and let these animals infect the palace. She has ruined the great hall. Alaric did not even look at his cousin. He did not blink. He kept his pale grey eyes fixed entirely on me. He stopped before the wooden table, looking at the meticulous accounts I had written recording every sack of grain used. Princess Isolde, Alaric said, his voice terrifyingly calm. Return to your chambers. If I hear you speak of my people as animals again, I will have your tongue removed. Isolde gasped, her face draining of color, and she fled. Alaric looked back at me. I stood up slowly, facing him across the table. I was exhausted to my very marrow, but I held his gaze with absolute defiance. If he wanted to execute me for saving his kingdom, he would have to look me in the eye to do it. You acted without my royal seal, he said quietly. The words meant only for me. I acted with my crown, I replied smoothly. You commanded me not to embarrass the throne during my contract, your grace. Letting your people die at your locked gates while your nobles drank wine would have been an embarrassment I could not tolerate. He stared at me, really looked at me perhaps for the first time since he had forced a ring onto my finger. He looked at the soot on my dress, the bronze key resting against my chest, and the hundreds of subjects in the hall who were looking at me not as a tenant but as their savior. A muscle worked in his jaw. The coldness in his eyes shattered, replaced by something visceral and entirely unprotected. What is the number today, Aurelia? He asked, his voice suddenly sounding very hoarse. 252, I answered. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, as if the number had physically struck him. He nodded slowly. Then the kingdom owes you its life for another 252 days, Alaric said. He stepped back, and before the entire silent hall, the ruthless king of Valoria bowed his head to me. The shift in King Alaric did not happen with a grand theatrical declaration. It happened in the quiet, visceral spaces between us. After the winter siege broke, and the villagers returned to their rebuilt homes, the king began to appear in the rooms where I breathed. He no longer kept exclusively to his war chambers. He would enter the royal library while I was reading, taking a chair by the hearth, the firelight, catching the sharp angles of his face. He began to walk beside me in the palace gardens, his long stride slowing to match my measured pace. He was watching me. He was studying the woman he had bought for a year, as if trying to decipher a map he had previously dismissed as blank parchment. I permitted his presence. I did not encourage it. I wore my royal gowns, I attended to the petitions of the court, and every single morning I drew another heavy black line in my ledger. 190 days remaining. 172 days remaining. He would ask for the number at dinner, his voice low, lacking the biting arrogance it had carried in the first month. And every time I gave it to him, a muscle in his jaw would tighten, a microscopic fracture in his armor. I noticed it. I noted it with the cold detachment of a woman who knew that a king's fascination was not the same as a king's loyalty. I was still a tenant, and the lease was still running out, but a palace is a treacherous ecosystem, and a quiet king makes the court restless. No one was more restless than Princess Isolde. Isolde had not come to the capital merely to wear exquisite silks and sneer at the commoners. She was the daughter of the late king's younger brother. In the tangled, blood-soaked history of Valorian succession, she was the closest collateral heir to the throne. If King Alaric were to die without issue, or if his reign were legally invalidated, the crown, and more importantly, the vast unlocked wealth of the war coffers, would pass directly to her bloodline. I did not fully understand the danger she posed until the 8th month of my reign, when the air in the palace turned thick with unspoken threats. It was during a grand state banquet held in the cavernous hall of mirrors. The chandeliers blazed with 1,000 beeswax candles, their light reflecting off the crystal goblets and the heavy gold jewelry of the high nobility. I sat beside Alaric on the raised dais, wearing a gown of deep emerald velvet, the silver crown resting heavy and cold against my temples. Isolde sat to Alaric's right, holding court over a group of sycophantic lords. She was drinking heavy red wine, her cheeks flushed, her eyes glittering with calculated malice as they darted toward me. She had been orchestrating a whisper campaign for weeks, but tonight she decided to drag the poison into the light. It is truly a marvel, your grace. Isolde projected her voice so that the surrounding tables fell silent. How efficiently the queen has adapted to the luxuries of the capital. One almost forgets the unfortunate impoverished state of House Vance. Tell me, Lady Aurelia, She deliberately used my maiden title, a sharp insult that echoed off the marble walls. Do you find the royal silks too heavy for shoulders accustomed to ruin? The nobles held their breath. A few of Isolde's loyalists hid smirks behind their wine glasses. Alaric shifted beside me, his hand tightening around the stem of his goblet. I felt the heat radiating from him, the sudden violent tension of a king preparing to strike. Before he could speak, I reached out and rested my fingertips lightly on his wrist. It was the first time I had touched him willingly in public. He froze. I turned my gaze to Isolde. I did not raise my voice. I did not show anger. I let the silence stretch until her smirk began to falter under the absolute zero of my stare. I find the silks perfectly suitable, Princess Isolde. I said, my voice carrying the unhurried, elegant cadence of a true sovereign. Though I admit the weight of the crown does require a certain strength of spine, a strength that is perhaps difficult to understand for those who have only ever worn the luxury of the palace without ever bearing its burdens. Someone at a lower table coughed to cover a gasp. Isolde's face darkened to a furious mottled red. Burdens, she spat, abandoning the pretense of courtesy. You speak of burdens as if you are a permanent fixture rather than a temporary arrangement meant to bypass a legal inconvenience. Everyone in this room knows you are merely renting that silver on your head. When the year is up, you will be cast out exactly as you came in. Isolde! Alaric's voice cracked like a whip across the hall, vibrating with a terrifying, suppressed rage. You will guard your tongue, or I will have the guards escort you to the dungeons to find your manners. Let her speak, Alaric. I said smoothly, never breaking eye contact with the princess. She is not entirely wrong. I am here by contract. But while I am here, my seal commands the royal armies, my key opens the deep vaults, and my word is the law of this court. I suggest you remember that Isolde before you find yourself exiled long before my contract ever expires. The hall was dead silent. The crystal pendants on the chandeliers clinked softly in the draught. Isolde stared at me, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. She abruptly stood her chair scraping violently against the stone floor and stormed out of the banquet hall. Alaric looked at me, his pale eyes blazing with an emotion that looked dangerously like awe. He leaned in his voice, a low vibration meant only for me. You did not need to defend yourself. I would have silenced her. I am the queen, Alaric. I replied coldly, pulling my hand back from his wrist. I do not require a king to fight my battles in a dining hall. Save your authority for the battlefield. I did not know it then, but my public humiliation of Isolde was the exact trigger she needed to launch her final desperate gamble. 2 days later, the Dowager Queen summoned me. When I entered her suffocatingly hot tower room, the old woman was not sitting in her usual chair. She was standing by the narrow window, gripping her cane so tightly her knuckles were bone white. Close the door, Aurelia, Eleanor commanded, and lock it. I did as she asked, a cold dread pooling in my stomach. What has happened? I have spies in the lower city, child, the Dowager rasped, turning her sightless eyes toward me. And they have brought me the details of a poison Isolde is brewing. She is not waiting for your year to expire. She has found a magistrate from the High Court who specialized in the ancient texts of the Royal Charter. She is looking for the fracture point. The fracture point? I asked, my breath catching. The war coffers. Eleanor explained, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. The law states that if Alaric completes his first year of marriage, the coffers unlock to him, and you are granted your family's stipend upon an amicable dissolution. But there is a hidden clause. A dark clause. If the marriage is terminated before the year is up, due to the Queen's demonstrable treason, infidelity, or abandonment of the palace, the contract is void. My heart slammed against my ribs. And the stipends? Revoked, Eleanor said grimly. Your family will be plunged back into ruin instantly. But worse, if the marriage is broken by the Queen's dishonor, the war coffers do not unlock for Alaric. They default to the closest collateral heir as compensation for the shame brought upon the royal house. Isolde. I breathed the sheer terror of it washing over me. Yes, Isolde, the Dowager confirmed. She is engineering a public scandal. She's going to manufacture a betrayal so massive that Alaric will be forced by the High Council to cast you out in disgrace before the 365th day. She wants your head, Aurelia, and she wants his gold. His! I stood frozen on the ancient stone floor. My ledger upstairs marked 119 days remaining. 119 days to survive in a palace that was actively trying to execute me. I touched the bronze key at my throat. My family's survival hung by a frayed silk thread, and the shears were already closing around it. The 20 days that followed the Dowager Queen warning were a masterclass in psychological warfare. The palace, once merely cold, became a viper pit. I watched my food. I locked my chambers myself at night. I drew my lines in the ledger with a hand that I refused to let tremble. 110 days. 198. Isolde moved through the corridors with the serene confidence of a headsman who has already sharpened the axe. I knew she was waiting for the perfect moment to strike a moment when the king was most vulnerable and the court was fully assembled. She found it on the morning of the 96th day. The High Council of Valoria was convened in the cavernous throne room for the monthly reading of the realm finances. King Alaric sat upon the raised dais, wearing the heavy crown of state, his face an impenetrable fortress. I sat on the slightly smaller silver throne to his left, clad in a gown of severe black velvet. The entire nobility of the capital was present, standing behind the councilmen. It was High Steward Vane who sprang the trap. As the Chancellor finished reading the tax yields, Vane stepped forward from the shadows of the pillars. He did not bow to me. He bowed only to the king. Your Grace, Vane voice echoed loudly, designed to reach every corner of the silent hall. I come before the throne with a heavy heart to report a treason so vile it threatens the very foundation of the royal house. The court murmured. Alaric leaned forward, his pale eyes narrowing. Speak, steward. It concerns the Queen, Vane declared, pointing a trembling theatrical finger at me. I have discovered that Lady Aurelia Vance has been utilizing the ancient bronze key to the deep vaults not to feed the poor, but to systematically siphon royal gold into hidden carriages bound for the Western Reach. She is funding a private mercenary army under her brother command. And worse, she has secured passage on a ship set to sail before the winter ends, planning to abandon the palace and the marriage contract, leaving the crown in ruin. The throne room erupted. Nobles gasped. Whispers flared into shouts. The accusation of treason was a death sentence. The accusation of abandonment was the exact legal trigger required to void my family's stipends and transfer the war coffers to Isolde. Princess Isolde stepped forward gracefully from the crowd, holding a thick sheaf of parchment sealed with what looked exactly like my father house crest. It brings me no joy to present this, Isolde lied beautifully, her voice ringing with false sorrow. But the High Magistrate and I intercepted these missives last night. They are letters written by the Queen detailing her theft and her plans to flee. She has broken the royal decree. By the laws of Valoria, the marriage is nullified. The stipends must be seized, and she must be sent to the executioner block for high treason against the crown. I sat perfectly still. The corset bit into my ribs so deeply I tasted blood in the back of my throat, but I did not gasp. I did not shrink back. I looked at the forged letters in Isolde's hand. It was a masterpiece of political assassination. Vane had access to the vaults. He could have easily moved the gold himself to frame me. Isolde had the wealth to forge my family seal. They had orchestrated a public execution of my character, and they had cornered the king. If Alaric defended me, he would be defending an accused traitor against the physical evidence presented by his own bloodline and his high steward. The nobles would revolt. If he condemned me, he would lose the war coffers to Isolde, and my family would be destroyed. He was staring at the nightmare of his childhood. A queen betraying the realm for her own family playing out right before his eyes. Silence crashed down over the room as the High Magistrate, an old man dripping in gold chains, stepped forward. The law is absolute, Your Grace, the magistrate intoned. If the Queen cannot prove her innocence this very hour, the contract is voided by her dishonor. The war coffers revert to Princess Isolde, and House Vance is stripped of all titles and lands. All eyes turned to the king. Alaric was as still as a statue carved from glacial ice. His jaw was locked tight enough to shatter bone. He looked at the letters. He looked at Isolde, whose triumph was practically radiating from her skin. And then slowly he turned his head and looked at me. He was searching my face. He was looking for the panic of a guilty woman, or the desperate pleading of a victim. He expected me to fall to my knees on the marble floor and beg for his mercy. I did not. I rose from the silver throne. The rustle of my heavy black skirt sounded like a drawn sword in the dead quiet of the hall. I walked down the 3 marble steps of the dais, my spine perfectly aligned, the silver crown heavy on my head. I stopped mere inches from Isolde, who instinctively took a half step back, unnerved by the absolute void in my expression. I did not look at the forged letters. I looked up at King Alaric. I told you on the day you arrived at my ruined home that I would count the days. I said, my voice carrying the clear, chilling resonance of a struck bell. I told you I would not hide my accounting. I've never lied to you, Alaric. If you believe that the woman who stood in the freezing courtyard to feed your people is the same woman who would steal your gold in the dark like a rat, then do not hide behind your magistrates and your cousin. Declare me guilty yourself. I held his gaze, refusing to blink, refusing to let him see the terror clawing at my insides. The court held its collective breath. Princess Isolde smirked, turning to the king. She is arrogant to the end, Alaric. Issue the decree, strip her of the crown. King Alaric stood up. His massive frame shadowed the dais. He didn't speak to Isolde. He walked down the marble steps, his heavy boots echoing like war drums. He stopped in front of me. He looked down into my eyes, and the cold, impenetrable fortress of the king shattered completely. In its place was a man who had suddenly realized he had built a trap for a prisoner only to lock himself inside with her. He turned his back on me and faced the court. High Steward Vane Alaric said, his voice deadly quiet. You claim the Queen stole gold from the deep vaults? Yes, Your Grace. I saw her agents. The deep vaults. Alaric interrupted, his voice rising. A terrifying rumble that shook the crystal chandeliers required 2 keys to open the inner sanctum. The Queen holds the bronze dragon, but the second key, the Iron Wolf, has hung around my neck since the day I was crowned. I've never taken it off. It is impossible to remove gold from the inner sanctum without my presence. Vain face, drained of all color. He began to stammer, taking a step back, but the letters, the gold. Alaric stepped forward and snatched the forged letters from Isolde's hand. He did not read them. He walked to the nearest massive iron brazier burning in the hall and dropped the entire stack of parchment into the flames. The letters are false, the king declared, his voice a roar that pinned every noble to the walls. The accusation is false. My queen has not betrayed this house, but someone in this room has. He turned to the captain of the guard, who was already drawing his sword. Arrest High Steward Vane for high treason and forgery against the crown, Alaric commanded. And Princess Isolde is to be confined to the highest tower under heavy guard until the royal inquisitors determine her role in this plot. If the magistrate objects, throw him in the dungeons as well. Screams erupted. Guards swarmed the hall, seizing a sobbing Vane and a shrieking, furious Isolde. You cannot do this, Isolde screamed as she was dragged away. She is a parasite. She is stealing your throne. Alaric ignored her. He turned back to me as the chaos swirled around us. The court was in absolute pandemonium. But I felt completely frozen. He had just risked a civil uprising. He had just burned evidence without a trial. He had acted as a tyrant, all to protect a woman he was scheduled to throw away in 96 days. He stepped incredibly close to me, his chest rising and falling heavily. He reached out his gloved hand, hovering for a second, before he gently, almost irreverently, touched the side of my face. What is the number today, Aurelia? He whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion that sounded terrifyingly like despair. 96, I breathed. He closed his eyes, dropping his hand. For 96 days, he said, I am asking you to trust me. I know what I have not earned the right to ask, but I'm asking you to survive this with me. I looked at the ashes of the forged letters floating in the heat of the brazier. The plot had failed, but the truth remained. He had saved my life, but he still owned my family fate. I nodded, once the silver crown heavy on my head, and went back to my chambers to draw another line. The morning after the trial, the air in the royal palace felt as brittle as spun glass. I stood in my chambers, the heavy velvet drapes pulled back to let in the pale, sharp light of the fading winter. My fingers were numb as I reached for the top drawer of the mahogany vanity. I pulled out the leather-bound ledger. I dipped the quill in the black ink. 95 days remaining. I traced the line, slowly feeling the scratch of the metal nib vibrating up my arm. The threat of the executioner's block had been burned away in the iron brazier, but the terms of my sentence had not changed. I was still a prisoner of the crown, bound by a contract that required my exit. The king had saved my life, yes, but he had not done it out of love. He had done it because he was a man of honor who refused to let a false accusation stain his reign. That is what I told myself as the corsets were laced tight against my ribs. That is what I believed as I pinned the silver crown back into my hair. But the King Alaric who remained in the palace after Isolde's arrest was not the cold, unyielding ruler who had invaded my father's ruined hall 11 months ago. The shift was terrifying in its quietness. He did not flood my chambers with apology gifts of silk or jewels. He knew better than anyone that a woman who had sold her life for a royal stipend could not be bought with trinkets. Instead, he began to give me the only currency he truly valued, the kingdom itself. He ordered my silver throne moved closer to his on the raised dais, so close that the heavy fabric of our ceremonial cloaks brushed against each other when we sat. When the High Council presented petitions for trade routes or military outposts, Alaric would not answer immediately. He would turn his head, his pale grey eyes fixing on me in the dead silence of the throne room, and he would wait for my judgment. "What is the Queen's counsel on this matter?" He would ask, his voice carrying the weight of absolute deference. The first time he did it, the councilmen nearly choked on their wine. A king of Valoria never deferred to a queen. It was the very trauma that had scarred Alaric's childhood. But he did it again the next day and the next. He was publicly, deliberately dismantling the defenses he had spent his entire life building, handing me the power he had sworn never to let a woman hold. I gave my counsel with a steady voice, keeping my spine rigid and my face an emotionless mask. I ruled justly. I commanded the room with the grace of the royal bloodline I had been born to. But every night I returned to my chambers and struck another day off the ledger. 70 days, 50 days, 30 days. As the snow began to melt in the palace courtyards, revealing the dark, dormant earth beneath the tension between us, it became a physical entity. It lived in the grand dining hall where we ate our silent meals. It lived in the corridors where our paths crossed. He watched me with a hunger that was not merely physical but existential. He was watching the clock run out, and he was realizing that he had absolutely no mechanism, legal or otherwise, to stop it without breaking his own sacred laws. On the 20th day before the expiration of the royal decree, I summoned the head of the household staff. I stood in the center of my sitting room, wearing a simple gown of dark grey wool, entirely unadorned except for the bronze key resting at my collarbone. "Bring the traveling trunks from the lower vaults," I instructed the trembling maid. "Place them in the corner of my bedchamber. I require 3 for my gowns and 1 for my books." By nightfall, the massive iron-bound leather trunks were sitting open on the Persian rugs. I did not pack in secret. I packed the way a tenant prepares to vacate a property when the lease is up. I folded the few personal items I had brought with me from the Vance estate. I left the royal silks and the heavy velvet cloaks hanging in the wardrobes. They belonged to the crown, not to me. Word spread through the palace like a fire in a dry forest. The Queen was packing. The Queen was actually going to leave. 2 days later, Alaric walked past my open doors. He was flanked by the captain of the guard and a scribe discussing the deployment of the Southern Fleet. As he passed my chambers, his eyes flicked inward and landed on the open traveling trunks. He stopped so abruptly that the scribe nearly crashed into him. Alaric stood in the corridor perfectly still, his jaw locked. He stared at the trunks as if they were a vanguard of an invading army. He looked at me, standing by the vanity holding a stack of letters from my mother. The devastation that crossed his face was so profound, so violently raw, that I had to look away to keep my own breath from failing. He did not say a word. He turned sharply and walked away, his heavy boots echoing like a death knell down the hall. On the 5th day before the end, he came to my chambers at midnight. He did not knock. He simply opened the door and stood in the threshold. He was not wearing his crown nor his armor. He wore a simple black linen shirt, the collar undone, his hair disheveled. He looked entirely exhausted, a man who had fought a war on 100 fronts and realized he had lost the only battle that mattered. "Aurelia," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp that scraped against the quiet room. I was sitting in the armchair, by the fire reading. I carefully marked my page and set the book down. Your Grace, it is late. He stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him. He looked at the trunks now nearly full and strapped tight. I have spent the last week with the High Magistrate. Alaric said, his eyes returning to my face. I have amended the royal decree. The stipends granted to housefants are now legally severed from the marriage contract. They are permanent, irrevocable, and guaranteed by the Walk Office for the next 3 generations, regardless of what happens to us. My heart gave a painful, violent thud against my ribs. Why would you do that? Because you should not have to leave this palace out of fear. He stepped closer, the heat of his presence overwhelming in the cold room. And you should not have to stay out of obligation. I wanted the gold to be yours, securely yours, so that you understand the choice is entirely your own. I looked up at him. The grey of his eyes was entirely shattered. I made a contract for 1 year, Alaric. I said, my voice remarkably steady, despite the storm raging inside me. I agreed to sell my presence, my name, and my freedom for 365 days. The stipends were the price. I do not require charity or amended laws to fulfill my end of the bargain. I am not offering charity. He suddenly shouted, the restraint finally breaking. He closed the distance between us, falling to one knee before my chair. The King of Valoria, the man who made entire nations tremble, kneeling on my rug. He reached out and grabbed the arms of my chair, trapping me in his desperate orbit. I am offering you the kingdom, Aurelia. He breathed, his voice breaking. I am asking you to stay. Not as a contracted bride, not as a tenant, but as the only queen this realm will ever answer to. Stay as my guest, stay as my equal, just. Stay. I looked down at him. My chest was tight, my throat burning with unshed tears that I absolutely refused to let fall. He was offering me everything, but he was offering it on day 360. He had spent the entire year watching me count down, letting me endure the silent humiliation of the court, only realizing my worth when my trunks were packed at the door. You agreed to 1 year, I whispered, reaching out and gently removing his hands from the arms of my chair. And I have spent 360 days being counted down, Alaric. Whatever you feel right now, or whatever you think you feel, has arrived far too late to be trusted. He stared at me, the finality of my words striking him like a physical blow. He slowly stood up, his massive frame seeming hollowed out. What is the number today, Aurelia? He asked, his voice entirely dead. 5, I answered softly. He nodded, a jerky, mechanical movement. He turned and walked out of my chambers, closing the door softly behind him. He did not speak to me for the next 4 days. The silence in the palace was absolute, the heavy, suffocating quiet, before the executioner's blade finally falls. The dawn of the 364th day broke over the capital like a bruised eye, spilling weak violet light across the cold marble floors of my chambers. I did not ring for my ladies in waiting. I dressed myself. I did not put on the heavy, jewel-encrusted velvet gowns of the Valorian court. I wore a simple dark riding habit from my days at the ruined Vance estate, the fabric worn soft at the elbows. It was the dress of a tenant whose lease had officially expired. I walked to the mahogany vanity. I opened the top drawer one final time. I drew the last heavy black line in the leather-bound ledger. 1 day remaining, but I was not going to wait for the final day to bleed out. I wanted the ending to be mine, orchestrated entirely by my own hand, not dictated by the ticking clock of his royal decree. I lifted the heavy silver crown of the queen from its velvet stand. It felt colder than usual against my bare hands. I walked out of my chambers and through the silent corridors, the echoing of my leather boots sharp and final against the ancient stone. The palace was still asleep, bathed in the grey shadows of early morning, but I knew the king would be awake. He had not slept since the trunks were brought to my room. I found him in the vast, echoing expanse of the grand throne room. He was sitting on the massive iron and gold throne of Valoria, entirely alone in the dim light, staring out at the empty cavernous hall. He was not wearing his crown. He was not wearing his armor. He looked like a man who had survived a brutal war, only to realize he had successfully defended a graveyard. I walked up the center aisle. He watched me approach, his pale grey eyes tracking my every step, taking in my simple riding habit and the gleaming silver crown resting in my hands. I stopped at the base of the dais. I did not bow. My spine was as straight as it had been on the day he invaded my father-ruined hall. I walked up the 3 marble steps. I stopped beside him, and I placed the silver crown of the queen gently on the empty velvet seat of the silver throne next to him. Then I pulled his heavy royal signet ring from my finger and laid it carefully beside the crown. Finally, I reached behind my neck and untied the frayed black silk ribbon. The bronze dragon key clinked softly against the silver ring. "Today is day 364, I said, my voice steady and clear in the cavernous silence. "I am returning these a day early because I want the last day to be mine and not the contract. The carriage will arrive at the courtyard at noon tomorrow. I will be gone by 1. Alaric stared at the crown, the ring, and the key resting on the silver throne. He stared at them for a terrifyingly long time. His chest rose and fell in a jagged, uneven rhythm. When he finally looked up at me, his pale eyes were stripped of every defense, every wall, every ounce of royal arrogance he had ever possessed. "May I have the day?" he asked quietly. I frowned slightly. "For what?" To say what I should have said in the first month, he replied, his voice rough but completely steady. "In my own time. In my own way." Without expecting an answer, "I am not asking you to stay, Aurelia. You gave me your answer 4 days ago. I am asking you for 1 day in which I am permitted to speak without the least counting against me." I looked at the man who had bought me, who had saved me from the executioner block, and who was now breaking apart in front of me with absolute dignity. "1 day," I agreed softly. "And then the carriage." "And then the carriage," he echoed. What the king did in the 24 hours that followed is the reason the kingdom eventually bowed to the truth. He did not court me. He did not flood the room with musicians or desperate declarations of love. He had learned over the past year that the woman he had married could not be overwhelmed and she could not be bored. Instead, he did 3 things. First, as the sun fully rose, he took me down to his private council chamber. He unrolled a massive parchment across his dark oak desk stamped with the permanent golden wax seal of the High King. It was a royal deed. "This is not the royal stipend we agreed upon," Alaric said, sliding the heavy parchment toward me. "This is the deed to the entire Western Reach, including the sovereign rights to the trade ports and the border garrisons. It is in your name. Not your father, not your brother. Yours." I stared at the document, the sheer magnitude of the power he was handing over. "You governed my people during the winter siege when I was not here." Alaric continued, his eyes locked on mine. "You protected a realm that was not yours to protect without asking for permission or glory. I owe you a piece of the earth you saved. It cannot be revoked by me or by the council or by any future king. It is yours until the end of your days." Second, in the late afternoon, he took me up the winding stairs to the high tower to see the Dowager Queen. Eleanor was sitting by her fire, wrapped in a thick wool shawl. She turned her sightless eyes toward us as we entered. Alaric stepped forward and placed the bronze dragon key into her withered, trembling hand. "She returned it to the throne this morning," Grandmother Alaric said quietly. Eleanor ran her thumb over the worn teeth of the bronze key. She did not speak to him. She stood up, leaning heavily on her cane. She walked past the king as if he were merely a shadow, and she stopped directly in front of me. She reached out her fingers, finding my neck. She tied the frayed black ribbon around my throat once more. "This is mine," the Dowager Queen rasped, her voice echoing sharply in the stone room. "Not his, not the kingdom, mine. I gave it to you on the day you married him, and I did not give it as a loan to a contracted bride. I gave it as a gift to a true sovereign. My grandson was an absolute fool to call it otherwise, and I am correcting him now in front of you. Whatever you decide to do tomorrow, Aurelia, this key leaves with you." I looked at Alaric. He was standing very still by the oak door, and his face was the face of a man who had just realized his grandmother had recognized his true queen long before he had. Third, and this is the piece that finally cracked the ice around my ribs. In the evening, after the palace had gone entirely silent, he asked me to meet him in the royal library. The hearth was burning low, casting flickering shadows against the towering shelves of ancient texts. Alaric was standing by the massive oak reading table. He reached inside his dark leather coat and pulled out a small worn book. It was not a royal decree. It was a leather-bound ledger. It looked exactly like mine. I kept one too, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. From the 41st day. The day I challenged you about your counting. He handed it to me. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened the heavy cover. I did not want you to see it. Then, he continued as I stared at the pages. I was ashamed at first that I was tracking you at all. And then, I was ashamed of what I was counting. I did not count down Aurelia. I counted up. I counted the number of days you had been in my house, and I had failed to deserve you. I turned to the pages. Each one contained a single line, a visceral record of a king entirely undone. Day 41. She did not hide the ledger from me when I challenged her. She is not cruel. I assumed she would be. Day 110. She humiliated Isolde to protect the dignity of the throne, not herself. Day 252. I returned from the north to find her ruling my kingdom from a wooden table. She did not ask for my permission to save my people. Day 290. I am in absolute terror. Day 360. She is packing her trunks. I have built a year on a foundation of arrogant laws, and I'm running out of time. I closed the book. The leather felt incredibly heavy in my hands. The silence in the library was so profound I could hear the ash settling in the dying fire. Thank you, I said, my voice thick, fighting the violent tightening of my throat, for showing me this. I did not show it to you to persuade you, Alaric said, taking a deliberate step back so I would not feel trapped. I showed it to you because you deserve to know that you were seen. You were not a ghost in this palace, Aurelia. You were seen from the 41st day. I simply did not know how to be a man instead of a king and tell you. I know you will leave tomorrow. I understand. And he did. That was the most devastating part of it all. He finally understood. I handed the ledger back to him. I turned and walked out of the library, leaving him standing in the shadows of his ancestors. I went to my chambers, and I did not sleep. The carriage would arrive at noon. The courtyard of the capital was a blinding expanse of white stone and winter sun when the great bell of the chapel struck noon. The royal carriage, emblazoned with the crest of Valoria, stood waiting, its black horses breathing plumes of steam into the freezing air. My iron-bound trunks had already been strapped to the back. I walked down the grand marble staircase of the palace for the final time. I did not look back at the Queen's wing. I did not look up at the chandeliers. I kept my gaze fixed entirely on the heavy iron doors that led to freedom. The entire court had gathered in the massive foyer. They stood in absolute suffocating silence. There were no sneers today. The lords and ladies who had whispered about the temporary bride now bowed their heads as I passed. They knew what had transpired in the great hall during the winter siege. They knew that the woman walking out the doors had saved their lives when their king was away, and their laws had failed them. King Alaric stood at the base of the stairs directly in my path. He wore his full ceremonial armor, the dark steel absorbing the pale light. But he didn't wear the crown. His face was a mask of carved stone, but his pale grey eyes were entirely shattered. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, waiting for the floor to drop. He did not plead, he did not make a scene. He kept his word, he gave me my day. As I reached the bottom step, the sea of nobles parted. I stopped before him. For a long moment, the air between us crackled with the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. The ledger, the key, the throne I had left empty. Your grace, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. I dipped my head in a shallow, respectful nod, not a bow of submission, but a sovereign acknowledging an equal. Aurelia, he replied, his voice rough, scraping against the absolute quiet of the room. He stepped aside. The path to the doors was clear. I walked out into the freezing courtyard. The cold bit into my face, but the bronze dragon key rested warm against my skin beneath the heavy wool of my traveling cloak. I stepped into the carriage without looking back. The footman closed the door with a sharp final click. The driver cracked the whip, and the heavy wheels began to roll over the cobblestones, carrying me away from the palace, away from the contract, and away from the man who had realized my worth entirely too late. I did not weep as the capital faded into the distance. A year of being counted down from a year of existing as a placeholder in a deadly Game of Thrones does not heal in a single afternoon. It requires time to rebuild the foundation of a soul. I went to the Western Reach. I took possession of the lands Alaric had deeded to me. The Vent's name was restored to its former glory, backed by the irrevocable stipends. My brother became a commander. My sisters were brought to my new estate safe and wealthy. I governed my province with the same iron will and quiet grace I had used to govern the Great Hall during the blizzard. The trade routes flourished. My people prospered. I was a queen in everything but name reigning over a kingdom of my own making. But back in the capital, the victory of the war coffers had turned to ash. Word reached the Western Reach through traveling merchants and loyal nobles. The royal funds had been unlocked. The northern borders were fortified. The kingdom was more secure than it had been in a century. But the palace had become a tomb. King Alaric ruled with ruthless efficiency, but the court whispered that he had become a ghost. The state banquets were silent affairs. The silver throne beside his remained deliberately empty. He forbade any attendant from even dusting it, leaving it exactly as it was on the morning I had placed the crown upon its velvet cushion. Isolde remained locked in the high tower, her ambition rotting in the dark. The king had won his absolute power, but he had lost the only force that could make the kingdom breathe. I did not write to him. I could not yet. The wounds of the contract required space to scar over. But in the 4th month, a raven arrived with a short missive. It detailed the trade tariffs of the capital and ensured my borders were protected. It was signed simply Alaric, not the king. I did not reply. I did not. He wrote again. In the 5th month, a brief note hoping the spring rains had been gentle on the western crops. In the 6th month, the sky over the Western Reach was turning the deep bruised purple of early autumn. I was standing on the stone terrace of my fortress, reviewing the harvest ledgers with my stewards when a deafening horn sounded from the valley below. It was not a warning of attack. It was the royal call of Valoria. I walked to the edge of the terrace and looked down the winding mountain road. A massive column of armored riders was approaching the black and gold banners of House Sterling snapping in the wind. At the head of the vanguard rode King Alaric. He did not bring a carriage to summon me. He did not send an emissary. He had ridden across the kingdom himself. The procession halted in the expansive courtyard of my estate. My personal guards drew their weapons, unsure of the king's intentions, but I raised a hand signaling them to stand down. I walked slowly down the stone steps, my dark skirt sweeping the ground, my spine rigid. Alaric dismounted. He was covered in the dust of a long, hard ride. He looked exhausted older, his face weathered by 6 months of carrying a hollow crown. But when his pale grey eyes locked onto mine, a desperate blazing fire ignited within them. He walked toward me, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. The elite King's Guard, the most lethal men in the realm, watched in absolute silence. My stewards held their breath. Alaric stopped 3 paces from me. He looked at the fortress I had rebuilt. He looked at the guards who answered only to me. And then he looked at the bronze key resting at the hollow of my throat. He did not offer a royal decree. He did not issue a command. Before his entire army, before my people, the absolute unyielding king of Valoria dropped to one knee in the dirt. A collective gasp ripped through the courtyard. A king bows to no one. A king kneels for no mortal. But Alaric placed his armored hands on the hilt of his sword, planted it in the earth, and bowed his head to the woman he had once bought for a year. I have secured the kingdom. Alaric set his voice raw, carrying across the silent courtyard. I have fortified the borders. I have fulfilled every duty the crown demands of me. But the palace is dead, Aurelia. The throne is completely empty, and I cannot survive the silence anymore. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with a vulnerability that laid his soul completely bare. I am not here to offer you a contract, he continued, his voice breaking. I am not here to buy your time. I'm here to ask you to return, not because the law requires it, but because you are the only sovereign this realm will ever answer to, and you are the only woman I will ever love. Command me to leave, and I will ride back to the capital and never disturb your peace again. But if there is any mercy left in you for a fool who realized his error too late... He swallowed hard, the tension in his massive shoulders vibrating. What is the number today, Aurelia? He whispered. I stood above him, looking down at the most powerful man in the world, kneeling in the dust for me. I felt the phantom weight of the ledger, the heavy black lines, the corset of ice I had worn for 364 days. I felt the coldness finally completely melt away. I reached down. I placed my hands on his armored shoulders, feeling the violent shudder that ran through his body at my touch. I urged him to stand. He rose slowly, towering over me, his eyes searching my face with a terrifying, desperate hope. I smiled. It was the first true, unguarded smile I had ever given him in the entire history of our acquaintance. I have stopped counting, I said softly. We returned to the capital 3 weeks later. There was no quiet ceremony in the shadows. The gates of the palace were thrown wide open. The streets were lined with tens of thousands of citizens cheering for the queen who had saved them in the winter, the queen who had returned to them in the autumn. When we entered the grand throne room, the entire court was assembled. But this time, as I walked up the center aisle, the nobles did not just bow their heads. They dropped to their knees, their silks pooling on the marble floor, submitting entirely to the woman who had conquered their king without ever drawing a sword. Alaric took my hand. He led me up the dais. He picked up the heavy silver crown from the velvet cushion where it had rested for 6 months, and he placed it gently upon my head. He had thought the year would break me. He was wrong about a great many things, but he was right about one. A year can be enough if it is the right year, and if, at the end of it, a kingdom learns exactly who holds the true power.